basically I want to make the shape of barbed wire. So if you look at barbed wire, opened up so many oven ads today. But if you look at barbed wire, it's basically, usually it's end up like twisting pieces of wire with these little tiny cut pieces of wire that are wrapped around it, and these are like the spiky little painful things. There's also some that have like razors like embedded in them, but for now this is what I'm going for. So to get this actual like little twisted wire effect, first I'm going to do is going to go through and rebuild my curve, because I want basically an even number or an even distribution of these little vertices on it. So I'm just going to select the curve, go to curves, rebuild, and uniform. I'll set this to maybe like 30. Basically this is just going to make, I'm going to extrude along this and do a little twist, and that's just going to make the twist be a little bit more even and not sort of cluttered in areas where there's a lot of control vertices. So I'm going to run through and I'm just going to make basically a really not super fancy profile of this wire. So I just made, you know, 2 little circular planes. I'm just going to go mesh combine, and I will scale those down something maybe like this. And then I'm also going to go and just put those pretty much as close as I can to the base of that curve. So again, these are just polygon little planes that I made, and I'm going to extrude them along this curve. To do that, you need to select the faces of those polygons. It has to, for some reason it has to be the faces, it can't be the actual just polygon object. So select faces and then just shift click on your curve and use your regular extrude tool that would use if you're just doing regular polygon modeling. By default, it should do something that looks like this, which looks horrible. If you look in your extrude settings, you want to bump the number of divisions up. So in this case, I might say somewhere maybe, I think I put like 30 CVs in there. Okay, all right, I'm just going to make this like 100 because I'm feeling spazzy. And you can see that now that is a polygonal object that is following this curve. If I move the curve around, it's still going to take that polygonal object with it. The setting that I want to make this like really kind of like poppy and interesting is twist, which isn't by default displayed here. If you do want to look at it there, there's this little hamburger menu right in the top of this pop-up. Click on that. It'll give you all these different options that you can, like here's twist. If I click on that, it's going to start displaying that in this pop-up by default when it comes up. So if I play with twist, usually you end up having to enter like some insanely large number into this. Like I'm just going to go ahead and be like, what if I put in 5,000? And you can see that now we have basically like a sort of twisted wire effect in that, for that curve. Cool. So we have this like very awkward sort of twisted braided wire effect. This is going to be, you know, base of the wire. If I wanted to, so like I clicked out of my extrude, so I don't have that little pop-up anymore. Since this is the last thing I did to this curve, I can go into my channel box, and if I haven't deleted history on my object, I should still be able to see that extrude. So I'm going to click on that, and you can see that I can go in and then modify twist if I want to, so I might set that to like 7,000. If I did set it up to something really high, like 10,000, there's a little bit of kind of like weird effect there. Basically, that was just because, let me actually do it really quick. All right, so like 10,000, and you can see that there's like some really gross like pulling and funky artifacting happening. You could either smooth that curve, that would pretty much fix it. If you wanted this to be low poly, I mean, this isn't super low poly at this point, but I could go in and just add maybe another 100 divisions into, oh god, no, not 4,000, 400. And that will also pretty much take care of it. Basically, it's just like the face is sort of pulling a little bit from that twist. And either smoothing it or adding more divisions will fix that. But basically, this is, again, going to be just sort of like the little twisty bit of our wire. Any questions on this? All right. For the actual barbed parts, easiest thing I can think of, since it's pretty much just a piece of wire wrapped around itself a few times, is to start with a, where is it? Helix. You gotta love a good helix. All right, so I'm just actually gonna say that that doesn't look completely horrible to me. I'm just gonna take the subdivisions down because it's completely unnecessary to have 50. And I'm just gonna throw it out there, so I'm just gonna grab these end caps and extrude them straight out. You should totally get rid of the n-gons on the end of this. I'm just not going to right now. And you can modify your coil, so now you have something that like looks kind of like a spiky little death thing. And I'm going to use Mash. This is a very awkward object. I'm going to use Mash to basically take this object and duplicate it a bunch of times along this curve. So just select this little metal spike thing, go back to Mash again, and once again just click the little Create Mash Network button. It's going to hide my original object and basically make 10 duplicates of the other one. So I will go into this Mash Distribute and pretty much do the same thing that I did before, or sorry, go into my Mash Network. I want this to show up along the curve, so I'm going to add the curve node, and then middle mouse button drag the base curve into this little thing here. And once again, you'll see that it is totally not following the curve. I just need to go into my distribute and set distance to 0. And I'll set step all the way up to 1. And you can see that now we have, you know, these little barbs that are following along the wire, except they look kind of weird because they're facing the wrong direction, like the hole isn't going with the wire, so it looks kind of silly. This is another thing where I think it's personally easiest to just go through and rotate this. It looks like 90 degrees. I just sort of like rotate it around until it shows up in a better direction than I'm actually expecting. But as soon as I do that, you can see that all of these pretty much pop into place, and they actually look like they're wrapped around that barbed wire. So you can leave it like this, or you could, again, just go in, add a little bit of randomization to these little barbs. Because to me it feels a little weird that they're all facing the same direction. So I'm just going to go into my Mash Network again and make another random node. And again, by default, it does a thing where position is like always set to 1, which I don't really want. In this case, I just want rotation of... I usually end up just playing with it until I find the axis I want. So I think X looks like the one that's least deforming things. So I'll just add a bunch of variation to X, and you can see that all the little barbs are now facing different random directions. And again, same with the rest of the things. If I wanted to grab this curve, I can take this and shift it around, and it's going to sort of keep all of my shapes the way they are and just basically make different shaped barbed wire. I don't know, I just thought that was like super cool and like a very easy way to do that. Any questions on the barbed wire? Cool. Any questions on any of the Mash stuff that I've gone over so far? All right. So there are 2 other things that I think might be kind of helpful for if you guys are doing this for your final. The first is if you happen to, or if you're like seeing outside of a window or something like that and you want to just make like a grassy field. I will try to keep the like grassy field demos to a minimum because like grassy fields are like kind of blah. But I'm just gonna be like, cool, here's my awkward little field on an awkward little hill. And I'm gonna make some plain grass. I need to turn on interactive creation. This is... Alright. Alright, so I'm just gonna make like a very awkward little strip of grass. And height, cool. Give it some subdivisions and also rotate it around 90 degrees. I'll put this back on the 0. All right, so here's my awkward little grass. I'm just gonna shift this up so that it's sitting directly at 0, 0. So I'm just gonna basically snap the pivot point to the bottom of this grass and then hold down X to put it directly on top of the grid. I will then freeze the transformation of that object. Or, I'm sorry, freeze, actually I'll freeze everything, what the heck. So now we have, if we zero this out, it's gonna come right back to the center here. In this case, I'm gonna use a few deformers to like give this grass a little bit more of an interesting shape. So I'm gonna grab this and just do nonlinear flare, and, nope, always the wrong way. All right, so I'm just gonna flare it out like this a little bit and be like, great, now it's kind of pyramid shaped. Still has all my like nice subdivs in there. I don't know, I just think it's a nice touch. So I deleted history, that got rid of the deformer, locked the shape in place. I'm gonna label this ground really quick. And next thing I'm gonna do is go in and add a bend deformer into this. Maybe just to do something a little bit interesting where, you know, the grass is sort of curved in some kind of direction. I will set the low bound to be 0 because I find it kind of awkward that the grass is just curving from the root and not hovering in the ground. So here we have our glorious piece of grass. It's super pretty. Next thing I'm going to do is, again, make another mesh object. So this time, all right, select my grass, not the deformer, just the grass. And once again, go into the mesh tab, create mesh network, and now we have lovely grass duplicates. So if I go into my distribute node, I'm just gonna set this up to like maybe 50. Oh my, so much grass. And this one, so for distribution type, this one you actually can just set it to be mesh. So once you set distribution type to be mesh, it's pretty much asking you, hey, like, tell me a mesh that you want these to be populated on. So I'm going to, again, grab my ground, middle mouse button, drag that, and dump that on input mesh. Dump that on input mesh. All right. If it doesn't work in the text, try it in the box. Mesh sometimes takes one or the other. It's very weird. But you can see that I now have all of my different, like, silly little blades of grass, and they're just sort of, like, hanging out very awkwardly on this plane. And they're, you know, kind of set facing the plane. So, again, not a bad way to do grass if you're looking to do that. There are a few settings, so I'm going to add maybe just like 150 grasses. So there's a few kind of weird settings that you can choose for this. So one of them is calculate rotation. So if you ever have like a really, really aggressive curve, like this one, you can kind of see that the bases of these grasses are kind of following more or less the normals of that hill. If you uncheck calculate rotation, it's going to not follow the normals and basically just point straight up towards the y-axis. Or you can also change that. If I set this to be 1, should sort of change that as well, but didn't. No, sorry, that was something else I was thinking of. But yeah, so if you're ever doing something like grass or whatever where you do need it to just be pointing like directly up, just uncheck calculate rotation and it's not going to follow the normals of the object. There's also a bunch of other settings that you can choose. There's like this ignore ramps button. If you scroll down, there's like some more ramps down here. To be honest, I haven't super figured out what exactly these do. But yeah. And then under distribution, so we set distribution type to be mesh. Under method, there's a few different options that you can choose. So usually the one you're probably going to want to use is scatter, which is basically just to say, hey, put these randomly across the surface of this mesh. You could set them to vertex, which is going to line them up perfectly, like little blades of soldier grass along all the different vertices on this plane. I'm sure this like has its uses. It might be an interesting way to make hair plugs. I don't really know. We choose random vertices, like face center. Again, there's like just different ways that these are actually going to display on the actual mesh. In this case, we're going to keep using scatter because it looks least terrible. So any questions about just like how to get your little grasses to follow a mesh? All right. This could also potentially be an interesting way, and I played with them a little bit, to basically, if you had an object and you wanted to make it furry looking with cards, you could conceivably make a card and scatter it across the surface like this, and just pretty much use mesh to automatically make your object furry just with cards on the surface. So next I'm going to do, like I do find it a little weird that like all the grass is facing the exact same direction. So again, I'm just going to go in and add a random node. And in this case, there's no real point to do its position because it's already sort of randomly scattered across the surface. I don't feel the need to make that more random. But in this case, I can also go a little, I can, you know, play with rotation a little bit. For some reason, I don't know what it is, but like the rotation always, sometimes it like feels like it works really well and sometimes it doesn't. What am I? All right, so I'm just gonna like unhide my original grass And if I rotate, so like, and this is like the weird thing I haven't sort of quite figured out how to troubleshoot, but like, so if I rotate my grass on the Y, this one is gonna rotate in a certain direction, but then if I use this one, it like rotates it a completely different way, which I like really haven't figured out exactly how to fix that. Oh, that's what it was, wasn't it? All right, that's what it was. All right. So if you're ever using a random node and rotation isn't doing what you expect, go back into your mash distribute and remember that like calculate rotation button. Make sure that is unchecked. That way all the grass is going to point straight up. You can see, so with this button unchecked, it's facing basically the exact same direction as the original one. If I check this, it starts rotating them all to the sides kind of randomly, and then your rotation in the mash random kind of behaves like really bizarre. So if that ever happens, just uncheck this in your distribute node. I always forget about that. But now I should be able to actually rotate the Y direction in a way that I was more expecting. So if I look at this, all the grasses are facing kind of different directions and it doesn't look as regular. You can also do maybe a little bit of Y and stuff and add some scale variation if you want. If you want some like very strangely clumped grass, but this is like, again, pretty much grass and mash. Any questions on this so far? All right. So the cool thing about this is I said I wasn't going to go super hardcore into animation stuff, but this happens to be kind of cool and easy. So I still have this bend handle on my original piece of grass. So if I go in and fiddle with the curvature, you can see that pretty much all the different little grasses are going to start bending super crazy. What you can actually do is animate this bend deformer, or if you have a rig on your character, you can animate that. So I'm just gonna do something very uncreative. I'm just frame 1, I'm gonna right click on curvature, do key selected, go to frame 25, and just set this to be some other completely random curvature. So again, I'm just gonna right click on that and do key selected. And all right, 67.609. All right, it's gonna be very awkward little looping grass. So I just went to another frame and pretty much just keyed it to be the same value there. So basically just made a really crappy looping animation. So we start out at 67 degrees of rotation or curvature. We go to -69 and then we come back to 67. So we play this, we have grass very happily waving in the breeze in a super aggressive, ridiculous fashion. All right, change my playback speed. Okay, that looks less ridiculous. So again, like this is a pretty easy way. Like if you ever need to do sort of like little repeating animations, you can do that in MASH. I was thinking the other day, I was like, oh, holy crap, like I could totally use MASH if I had like a flying dragon or like a flying bird. You could use MASH to, you know, have that little animated thing, populate a certain area with it, and then you can actually offset the animations a little bit so that they aren't all flapping at exactly the same time. So if I go into my MASH random, there should be, hang on, where is it? Oh no, sorry, it's a different node. All right, so if I did want to mess with the animation of this and like didn't want these grasses moving all exactly the same direction, I'm going to go back into my MASH network and make what is called a time node. Basically, this allows you to do a little bit of controlling of the animations themselves. So if I go into that node, you'll see it's asking for where is the start and end of the animation that you want to use or loop. So in this case, it's frame 1 to 45. So if I set that, you should see that it pretty much plays the exact same way that it did before. What becomes really powerful is this stagger frames. And this is basically saying, so again, you can see right now the grass is like pretty much going at exactly the same time, which is a little awkward. If I set stagger frames to be something like 10, what's going to happen is you can see that they're all kind of blowing at like slightly different directions, it looks like a little bit more random. So this would be really good for doing something like trees blowing, leaves, etc. Just be aware, so if you're doing this one's actually not too bad. These are definitely better computers that I had. If you have like a bazillion copies of this mass distribute, like right now I only have 150. If you're doing a whole grassy field and you have like 5,000 grasses, putting the stagger frames on is going to slow down your computer pretty dramatically. So it's usually not a bad idea to go back in and like set this number lower, and then like when you're done, set it to the higher value. Otherwise it can just take forever to calculate stuff. But yeah, so I mean you can do, you know, pretty weird stuff like that. They have options for time scale in this time node, so I could set the grass to blow like super slowly. Oh, I set it to 0, whoops. So like, again, it's going really slow. I could set it to blow really fast. It's really creepy. By default, 1 is just regular time. And then there's also options for a random time scale. So this would be pretty much each blade of grass gets a random scale value. So some are going to blow faster, some are going to blow slower. And you can see that this doesn't loop quite as nicely when I set it to that. But it does give you a pretty random looking effect for that weird blowing grass. That's pretty much that. Any questions on the time node? All right. So again, this could be really cool for something like, you know, a flock of flying birds or something if you wanted their wings to not flap the same direction. In this case, I'm just going to go through, and I actually kind of don't want to deal with this right now, so I'm just going to take this little time node here in the mesh editor and just toggle it off, because again, I just don't really want to deal with that. I'm happy with this for the time being. Only other thing that I kind of want to show you for the grass is the orient node. And this would be good if you wanted to add like a blowing, like rippling wind effect, or I don't know. You can do a bunch of different stuff with this. Honestly, I was kind of thinking of it. I'm like, ooh, this would probably be pretty good for clumping hair. For if you ever get into like doing hair sims, could probably make your life way easier for that. But go back into your mash node and look for orient. So I'm just gonna make that, and you can see by default it does like this really crazy, weird, I don't even know, it just kind of squished all my planes over to the side. And you can play with how exactly that works. So there's a few different options. One is velocity. I haven't quite figured out how that works yet. And one is aim at target and orient to mesh. I find the simplest one to just be orient to mesh. So I'm going to select that, and I'm just going to make, it's kind of like a tangible or a tangible example of how this works, but I'm just going to put this little weird sphere here. Go back to my orient node, and there's this little drop down for orient to mesh options. Click on that, and it's like, hey, you haven't given me a mesh yet. So I'm just going to, again, middle mouse button drag the sphere, throw it onto, see, like this one wants you to put it on the text, and all the other ones are on the box. It doesn't make any sense to me. Or it's just not going to work at all. This is a mesh. What are you doing? Sorry, this always takes me a second to set up. All right, so apparently once I deselect it and then reselect it, it allows me to put it on. And you can see, I mean, it's flipped on my grass the wrong way. In this case, I'm just gonna, there's a little button under your orient node for flip axis. Just click on that if it's facing the wrong direction. And you can see that all my grass is pretty much being sucked towards this little sphere now. So if I, shift this around, the grass is just sort of following that sphere. As I look at this particular one, I'm like, this might be interesting if you're ever doing like one of those weird, if you're ever doing like a scene where people are like in a giant dance hall or whatever, and they're like trying to catch someone stage diving. This kind of looks like the hands that would be pointing towards the person. I don't know, weird thoughts I think of. But so you can do stuff like this to control the rotation of your grass if you so desire. Give me a second. All right. All right. All right. Cool. So there's this, where you can just have all of the little grasses follow the ball. And I'm just going to delete this really quick. There's also what's called a fall-off object. And that is basically sort of similar to the sphere, so I'm going to click on this. I'm going to right-click in this little box and just do create. And it's going to put in this giant little sphere. And you can see that as I move this is actually kind of cute. As I move this through my grass, it's basically flattening the grass. Just in this specific area of this sphere. So if I click on this little guy, I have more options. I can set this to be a cube if I want to. Kind of pretty much whatever shape. You can link it to different meshes, particles, etc. I'm just going to leave it a sphere for now. Play with different nodes. The inner zone, so if I pull this up, think of the inner zone as kind of like a softness brush in Photoshop. So the smaller this is, the softer the area of effect is. If I make this the entire width of the sphere, you can see that it's a very sort of on or off, like you're either curved or you're not curved. It's not particularly natural looking. If I make this fall off zone smaller, you can see it's just sort of, it ends up like slowly pushing the grass over rather than just sort of like binary popping it from one position to another. And you can, again, like affect the fall off ramp if you want to do some like really weird stuff with this. Can't super think of applicable reasons to do this particular shape, but you can if you want. But what's kind of interesting with this, so if I imagine that I wanted to make something maybe like if you've ever looked at like wind rolling over thick grass before, it kind of like flattens it in certain areas. So what I could do is just sort of go up and maybe on frame 1, I'll set a keyframe on this fall off object. And on frame 45, I'm going to shift that object down to the other sort of diagonal corner of this little square. And I'm just pressing S to set keyframes, by the way. So now if I play this, you can see that my fall-off object is going to move across the grass, and it's sort of deforming the grass as it goes and like causing it to rotate. Does this make sense? Cool. The way in which this actually rotates is determined by your settings for your orient node. So if I'm just going to go back to my little mesh editor, click on mesh orient. So I'm going to just turn off this fall off shape really quick. So I'm just going to hit this little toggle button here. See if everything snaps back up to being pretty much, this is just showing what that orient node is doing. So in this case, I'm kind of looking at it and I'm like, well, I'm kind of moving my object a little bit backwards. Like if the wind is blowing from right to left, the grass shouldn't be flattening towards the wind, because that doesn't make sense. So I could either, where am I going? Hang on. I find this node to be a little awkward. All right. In this case, I'm not gonna lie, I'm just gonna be lazy. I'm just gonna shift my keyframes around so my thing is moving from left to right. But basically you can control like, the direction that this is pointing, and you just gotta like twiddle with the settings a little bit. You can do weird stuff if you change the up vectors, where like half the grass is pointing up and half it's facing down. Pretty much you can modify all this stuff, but I just shifted stuff because I'm lazy. So I'm gonna go back on, turn off my orient shape, or turn my orient shape back on, and play that, and you can see that my grass is just sort of, again, blowing slightly differently. All right, that was kind of weird. There's also another thing you can do, which is like kind of interesting, and this would be more if you want to make like an animated texture to do a more custom control on your windy grass. So I'm actually just going to delete this fall off object. And I'm just going to go in, and this usually, so I set this up, another version of this. If this one looks super terrible, I'll show you guys that one. It's in one of the files that I made, but you can go down, so strength of your orient constraint is pretty much the same thing as other strengths, like more or less an opacity slider. So if I go in and put a map on that, or strength map. So let's back up to 1. So there's this thing, strength map. If I add a map on that, in this case I'm just gonna add a ramp, because I like ramps. And you can see that anywhere it's black is gonna be no strength, and saying basically don't use that weird orient position that I made. Anywhere that's white is going to be all of that orient position. So what I can do if I want to is add a little bit of like wave in here. I could add some noise, etc. It's not particularly pretty at the moment. There we go. But you can animate ramps if you want. So again, this is probably done with something better done with something like a animated texture instead of like a weird animated ramp. But I'm just gonna say maybe a diagonal ramp would be interesting. Let's try this. So you can see that as I move this black slider back and forth, it's kind of creating this like strange pulling ripple in the grass. So I'm actually just going to animate the position of this black slider. So I'm gonna go to frame 1, and I am going to, actually I'm gonna start at frame 5. So select this black color slider in my ramp, and look at selected position. This is like basically where it is on this little slider here. If I right click on selected position and do set key, and then go to frame, say 40, and slide the black all the way to the other side, and again, right click on selected position and do set key. What I should have now if I scrub through this is you can actually kind of see that the black slider is changing position. So if I play this, you'll actually see that it is, you know, sort of interactively going through and like rippling this grass in like a sort of strange, windy way. I'm not saying that this is a particularly realistic effect for blowing grass, but if you did want to go and do something with maybe a little bit more interesting with like an animated text or something like that, that would actually have, you know, a pretty reasonable looking effect. Any questions on this? All right. So again, mostly just like showing you guys how to populate grass, or if you wanted to make it look kind of blowing around. Cool. All right. Only other thing that I can think of immediately for this is if you guys, I had a few people ask, so how to do like cards for snow and stuff like that. So Mash is a convenient way to populate cards around your scene if you needed either cards for like grasses. So I'm just gonna make a new scene. Like, aha, here's my ground, great. All right, so I'm just gonna make some like very quick and dirty, awkward little cards. So again, I'm just gonna set these, I like these just being on the origin, I think it makes things easier. And I want these to be sitting flat on the origin plane. So, what do you, snap, dang it, all right. So I have noticed that Mash tends to look at like 0, 0, 0 as the center of your object. So if your object is like going below the grid line, usually that's going to end up clipping through your object. If you don't care, like it doesn't really matter. It's just like kind of extra waste in polygons if you're caring about that. But what I'm going to do is basically the same thing. So I'm just going to grab this awkward little plane, do Mash, make another Mash object, and go to the distribute node, and set distribution type to be mesh. Again, grab my ground plane, throw in the ground plane, and I will also add some more grasses. So now we have like a very awkward little collection of tiny grasses that are just sort of like scattered across here. And you can see, so I forgot to freeze the transformation on my object, so you can see that like the planes are clipping through the ground plane that I made. So I'm just going to unhide my original grass and just freeze all. And as soon as I do that, it pulls all of the little planes up so that they are not clipping through the ground. Mash is like a little bit weird with translation rotation stuff. But basically, more or less is the same thing as setting up the grass. So I'm just gonna go through and just be like, hey, rotation. And if this had some kind of, little grass texture or something like that on it, this would make a really convenient way to just populate arbitrary clumps of like grass or flowers onto a scene. if you guys ever decide that you want to export this, so you can, if you select this, you can duplicate it, and that'll pretty much just like save a copy of your mesh. It's not going to be edited. You know, if I go in and change, if I go in and like change the random, you can see that it's not editing this duplicate that I made. So you can at any point like pretty much just take this and export these little planes to be an asset for Unity or wherever. Or just if you ever just want them to no longer be a MASH object, you can just duplicate them and get rid of your MASH network. So again, not a bad way to make little grass planes. In this case, I'm actually going to turn these just really quick. I'm just going to make this like super huge, and I'm going to make like the world's most awkward snow texture that's ever existed. So you can see that by scaling this up, it's basically just making a bunch of different crisscrossing strange planes, which is kind of the effect that you want if you're going for like a snow, or at least snow, maybe rain, depending on like how heavy and directional the rain is. But I'm just going to go in and add these a new Arnold material and basically just turn these all into cards again. I'm going to leave color as white because it's snow, and I'm going to go down under geometry, again hit the opacity tab, grab that. If you happen to be in my little file thing that I'm using, I do have this silly like dot texture. Ideally, you would make a better snow texture than this. This kind of looks like confetti. But I'm just going to grab this, hit 6 to toggle on my textures, and you can see that we've now made giant Dalmatian walls. In this case, so I'm going to grab my MASH object. I need to be like, yo, Arnold, this is opaque, or this is transparent. Check off opacity. I'm just going to go back to my texture and light node now. I actually just tried to make a portal light. It's like, you need a sky dome light. I'm like, meh. Portal lights also work with physical lights, by the way, in case I did not mention that. All right, so by default, we have this very awkward scene. And I basically just made Swiss cheese walls because the textures are backwards. So ideally, you would just fix this in the texture itself. In this case, I'm just going to be lazy. Under my file node, where I imported that dot texture, I'm just going to go under Effects and click Invert. And when I play that again, you can see that basically now I have a sort of very awkward snow layout. And you can see like this is casting shadows on the ground. If I rotate around, it's a little bit heavy because the texture I chose was like kind of stupid. But if I rotate around, you can see that it pretty much holds up from more or less all angles. It kind of just does look like a giant blob of extremely heavy like blizzard snow, but snow nonetheless. So if you were looking to populate snow outside a window or something like that, you could totally do it like this. The only other thing I would recommend doing for this is turning off self-shadowing. Strictly speaking, like snow does self-shadow, like if, you know, one flake of snow would cast a shadow on another flake of snow, but in this case, the flakes are so big that it's actually causing pretty aggressive, like weird shadowing in my scene that I'm not hugely a fan of. So I'm going to click on my little MASH object again, go back into the shape node, if I can find the shape node. All right, shape node. Grab this guy, and again, under the Arnold tab, same place you'd look for the opaque, there's a little option for self-shadows. Just check that off, and you can see like the whole thing brightened up pretty considerably. I just noticed like from certain angles, you really do see the like shadows in the crevices of like where the planes are clipping through each other, which is why I like to turn that off. You can also turn off cast shadows if you want, like if you didn't want the snow to shadow the ground, et cetera, et cetera. But that's pretty much, you could sub this out for like rain or conceivably even falling leaves. That'd be kind of weird actually, but you can do this for a bunch of different stuff. So any questions on this? All right. It also occurs to me, so there's this one, I probably pulled this up like a bajillion times in class already, but you could use, there's this one like crazy model in Sketchfab, the one that I like demoed for like, hey look, you can make clouds with cards like this thing. So like populating this with MASH probably actually wouldn't be completely horrifying. So if you just more or less just like made this giant puffy piece of geometry with either manually moving things around or using some kind of texture deformer. Heck, you could even sculpt it in like Mudbox or something. You could go in and then use Mash to take all of these different cards and just smatter them across the surface crazily, instead of having to sit there for hours and like manually rotate and position all of these. So Mash can be really powerful for like doing things procedurally. I'm super excited about the barbed wire, probably like more than I should be, but yeah. And there's like, honestly, there's like a lot more stuff that you can do with Mash. I think this is probably just the most relevant to what you guys would be doing for your final in terms of like using it to model things. But it does have a lot of applications for like texturing, sort of texturing to an extent, and definitely animating and doing like crowd simulation and stuff like that. So any questions on Mash? All right, cool.